think we'll get started, everybody. Thanks for taking the time this evening for coming out tonight. And this is our second session. Wendy Plandowski is our facilitator for tonight. And our topic is financial literacy, board accountability, running effective and efficient meetings. So I really hope that you take something out of it. Just a reminder that we do post a video of this on our Hockey Saskatchewan YouTube channel. And I know that several associations have advised us they shared the link from the last session with their entire board. So I encourage you to do that if you haven't done already. And so this will be posted there as well. And there's lots of other, neat little nuggets there on our YouTube channel for you to take a look at as well. So just a couple of people from our board on tonight. Timothy Hubick is our chair of the board, and Trevor Norm is one of our directors. They've joined us tonight, but we've got about 90 minutes here for you, so I'm not going to waste any more time talking, and it's all yours, Wendy.
Well, thank you so much, Kelly. It's a pleasure to be with everyone. I was just saying, as everyone was joining, what a beautiful day it is. I had some prairie chickens running past my window, so I think spring must be around the corner. We do have a full session tonight. I hope that I don't talk like an auctioneer when we're all said and done, because we have quite a few slides to get through. It is a robust session, which I hope that you'll enjoy. And as well, we'll make the slides available too. I know I didn't mention that to you, Kelly, but there is quite a bit of detailed information in these slides. And so I'll definitely send the PowerPoint presentations as a PDF off to Kelly. And then anybody that wants a copy of that is more than welcome to have that. So once again, we've got a PowerPoint to guide us along on our journey here. And so I'll just load that up. And so, as Kelly mentioned, tonight, our session is around board accountability and all of the different nuances that come with being a board member. So we'll just start off with a land acknowledgement. So as we gather here today, we acknowledge we are on treaty land and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects and give thanks to the First Nation and Métis ancestors of this place, those who walk beside us today, and those who will follow us in years to come. We are all treaty people. And so for those of you who were here last week or have been in my sessions before, you know that I am a little bit of a geek when it comes to nonprofit governance. I'm an active volunteer in both Alberta and Saskatchewan. And I'm currently the upcoming chair for the 2024 Saskatchewan Summer Games, a co-chair role. And I like to refer to myself as by border Wendy. I'm in a different time zone than some of you probably tonight. So I'll be glad next weekend when that changes. So our mission for today, we're going to talk about board member due diligence, but with a focus on finance tonight, overall risk awareness and diversion. We're going to talk about some of the duties of a board chair, board member engagement, and communication to membership. So like I mentioned, there is a lot to go through, and we will take a quick 5-minute break about halfway through. Kind of allows everybody a chance to get up and stretch, and for me to have a sip of tea or coffee just to keep the voice going. So we're going to roll right into financial skills for board members, accountability and responsibility. And so who is involved in financial management? Well, essentially, there's the board, the finance committee, if you have a finance committee, obviously the treasurer, maybe senior staff. And then oftentimes an auditor will play a role as well. And most nonprofits that are accepting hockey registrations and that sort of thing will have some kind of external eyes take a look at your finances at the end of the year. The existence of each depends on the size of your organization. Some small organizations, might only have, a treasurer as opposed to a whole finance committee. But essentially, all of us as board members have a role in the financial management of the organization. So one of the things that we know for sure is that our reputation of our organization often depends greatly on our ability to manage our finances. And so ultimately, we are responsible for that function. And financial challenges can often be the demise of both board members and organizations, but we can significantly reduce that risk just by being engaged board members and asking the right questions. And as we're going through the session, if anybody has any questions at any time, feel free to put those into the chat bar, or by all means, turn your microphone on and just raise your hand and fire away any comments or questions. So essentially, all board members are responsible for establishing a budget process and understanding the financial reporting system, planning and reviewing the budget, making sure that you have really good policies and procedures when it comes to financial management, monitoring any revenues and approving expenditures, participating in fundraising activities. That seems to be a big one right now for a lot of our organizations. And then also managing the financial assets of your organization. And so not just the financial assets, but physical assets, such as, your arenas. Oftentimes it's a rec board that, looks after different facilities in your community. So it might even be a sort of a joint project. So let's talk a little bit about the treasurer role. So typically this is one of 4 traditional officer roles. In a nonprofit context, the treasurer oversees the financial management and is the person that would generate reports to the board and, just communicate the financial status of the organization. Here's a sample job description for treasurers. And so they want to attend as many board meetings as possible. That's one of our key things with a lot of our executive positions. Definitely maintain knowledge of the organization and have a commitment to the goals. Understand some financial accounting for nonprofit organizations. If you have a large organization, you might even have a finance committee. And so they would often serve as the chair of that finance committee. Manage the board's actions with regards to, if there are staff, making sure that payments are made and that the appropriate remuneration rules are followed, that sort of thing. Present a budget to the board for approval. Review an annual audit and answer any membership questions that your membership might have about the audit or about the finances of the Hockey Association. And then, of course, maintain the bank account and supervise all the financial transactions. So it's a big job. And I know at our last session, we talked a little bit about managing the expectations of some of these more daunting roles. So oftentimes we get asked, I'm not an accountant, and so how can I be a treasurer? Well, the good news is everybody can be the accountant of a nonprofit with the right training and good board members to back them up. With the amazing onset of financial record keeping programs, your organization can invest a small amount of money each month just to support you through an online program. And so I know a lot of organizations will use Sage, QuickBooks, there's a number of different ones. And so sometimes the work is a little bit too daunting for large organizations. And that's where you might have a paid staff member that performs some of the financial transaction roles. And obviously that's something that some of your organizations have looked at or can look at depending on how you're managing your resources essentially. And so, here are some qualities possessed by great treasurers. And so, one of the things is you should be a critical thinker. You should have the ability to, understand your organization's financial standing, policies and procedures, and then make recommendations so that there's sustainability moving forward. Have an aptitude for organization. So all good treasurers possess excellent organizational abilities. They work with accuracy and keep impeccable records. You should understand the strategic planning process and how that impacts you. So for example, if one of the goals of your organization is to, include a new program, a new elite program, or maybe do some renovations to your arena, that sort of thing. So you should have a good understanding of what the direction or maybe what some of the future expectations are going to be so that you can start to manage the finances appropriately and be proactive as opposed to reactive when it comes to some of those expectations. Certainly an element of creativity, even though that's a bit of a paradox, creative accountants, but when it comes to generating funds, and perhaps even cutting expenses, new ideas and creativity can be key in an ever-changing and developing minor hockey association. definitely clear communication. And so we're going to talk about the importance of relaying information back to the membership on a regular basis, providing those important reports, that sort of thing. Some basic accounting skills, and then certainly some knowledge of your bylaws and constitution, just so that you make sure that you are following your local, that should be provincial, and of course federal government. And so here's some key components of the financial system that we want to make sure that we're keeping on top of. And so one of the things that you might want to do is, if you're a new treasurer, set up a meeting with the outgoing treasurer just to transfer files, ask questions, learn what your new duties and responsibilities would be. Ask for any previous budget information, just to make sure that you've got all of the existing financial documentation you need. Another great thing that you can do is create some kind of an electronic calendar, which documents when bills are due and upcoming payments. I know that's something that quite often gets dropped with volunteers when, one volunteer might be doing the role of treasurer for a year or two. We often forget to carry over that organizational calendar information so that people understand when remittances are due, when perhaps the financial year end is, all of those things that we sort of take for granted in our own personal life or in our professional life could be quite different with your minor hockey association. Provide an initial budget early on. Definitely obtain all of the bank account records and details, and updating signature cards, online accounts as soon as possible. Transferring credit card authorizations, and then just making sure that any checkbooks and that sort of thing are turned over to you as you assume control of the finances. So the financial control management means understanding how income comes in. So, obviously it's not always just minor hockey association fees. There might be fundraising activities, there could be grants coming in, that sort of thing. How the money is spent, so what the process is for that. Understanding any assets that you have, whether they're protected or invested. Some organizations might have some, significant savings that you would want to make sure that you understand the terms for that, interest rates, that sort of thing. And then, of course, just making sure that those finances are presented and accounted for. Some other key components of the financial system include, of course, then those procedures, the financial record keeping, and the financial reporting. And so this is just a little bit of a repeat slide just to hammer some of those ideas home. But, one of the things that you do want to make sure that you're understanding is that cash flow piece. So if you've got a lot of cash flow coming in at one particular point of the year, is there going to be, a question about cash flow with paying staff and that sort of thing before the next amount of funding comes through? So just really being on top of that cash flow, and managing any grants and contracts, also the risk management piece, and then the annual reporting, so income tax filing and statutory remittances. If you have clear policies and procedures in place, it just makes handing over that torch from one treasurer to the next treasurer just that much easier. And so just making sure too that there's more than one person involved in the control piece for all expenditures, that the chair should approve the expenditures, followed by the board. The treasurer prepares the payments that need to go out according to the signing policy. And then the policy it should include any supporting documentation according to best practice. And so depending on whether you want to follow another minor hockey association or another nonprofit when it comes to making sure that you've dotted your I's and crossed your T's essentially. Signing officer appointment, that needs to be documented, often through a motion. So when you go to your financial institution to change over signing authority, they're going to ask you for minutes of your meeting with motions, and those minutes will have to be signed. So just make sure that you are prepared when you go to change over those signing authorities. The other thing that's I think often comes up is petty cash policies. And it seems like petty cash is almost becoming a bit redundant. Not a lot of organizations do petty cash anymore. They have either prepayment cards or credit cards that they're managing their petty cash with. So one of the other really things that I think we don't focus on enough in our nonprofits, because we tend to trust a lot, which is a good thing, but that, it does come down to safe transactions. And so the board gives the authority to individuals to make transactions on the account, and that comes with a fair amount of responsibility. One of the signatures on checks written out of the organization's account should be the treasurer, if possible. The other should be the board chair. And if an individual is asked to take on some of the financial responsibilities, there should be an element of integrity that is expected and passed on to that person. So just, hitting that piece about 2 signatures on every check. I know some organizations that I've seen will pre-sign checks, especially if, you've only got 2 or 3 signers and it's summertime, for example, and maybe people are headed to the lake. But it's really important not to, disrespect any of those policies and procedures that are in place. And if an organization does get into the habit of pre-approving expenditures, it can, I think, increase your level of fraud significantly.
Yeah, Wendy, if I would really recommend people don't pre-sign checks. In my tenure here, there's been a number of associations that have run into difficulty with some people walking away with some, and then that becomes a very difficult situation, especially in a smaller community. So be very careful. I'll just give an example of what ours is. So,
perfect.
If an expense comes in, it goes through whoever in my staff in their department. They sign off on it. They provide the account that money goes to. It goes to our bookkeeper. Check is written, and then anything that's under $5,000, both myself and Derek Dureau in our office have signing authority. So we review it and we initial every invoice and we sign the check. If there's anything over $5,000, then it goes to Timothy, our chair. It's sent to him. He approves it, emails it back, and then we sign the check and goes on. So there's about 3 different levels of checks that we have, checks that we have in terms of approving an expenditure. So I really would caution people. And even if your association has a debit card, I know one association, their treasurer, everybody really trusted him, and they had maybe $30,000 at the start of the year, and by the end of the year, the account was drained, and they saw where that individual spent his money, and they didn't ask him for a report the entire winter at any of his meetings. Now, he did pay restitution after being charged, but so be careful on those types of things.
That's absolute best practice, Kelly, and thank you for pausing me and just letting people know what I guess the provincial organization expects, because I think that's really important. And I couldn't agree more on the debit card. I don't think that organized nonprofits should have debit cards. And that for that exact reason, that it's just too easy for small amounts of money to go missing. Best practice would be a credit card with a limit that can be checked on a regular basis. And so that credit card should be checked by the supervisor, whoever has the spending authorities in place to be checking that credit card. I have seen a lot of organizations move to e-transfer, which is okay because most financial institutions will require dual approval on those e-transfers anyway. And I think one of the things we have found, particularly since COVID, is it is getting maybe harder to get signatures on checks and that sort of thing. So e-transfers can be an effective method to do some of those expenses.
Other item that I know some associations ran into difficulties is if your MHA operates the kitchen or the canteen in the arena, and there's a lot of cash that's involved, and there's no tape or anything that's in, and there's been some associations that have experienced a cash bag walking away or two, and I think that's, if you got to put some real checks and balances in that, and you know, if you're having something to have a till and a tape that matches up at the end of the day, so that you have there's some accountability on whoever it is that's responsible for that cash at the end of shifts.
100%. And just another thing that I think a lot of nonprofits in GAIN, we're trusting of our fellow volunteers, but even doing those deposits and that sort of thing, especially after a large event like a tournament or something like that. And it's not even so much not trusting the person that is taking the deposit or that sort of thing, and just making sure that the amount of money is correct, 2 eyes are counting, that sort of thing. But you're also putting a lot of onus on that person if somebody was to accuse them of doing something. And so having that transparency, I think, is good to protect us as volunteers as well. So when it comes to reconciling a checking account, it is important to reconcile it each month. And I think what Kelly mentioned there, a reconciliation and a report every month would eliminate the longevity of some kind of fraudulent activity happening. It would catch it quicker. And so the method is to follow the procedures that are outlined, you know, on your bank statement, even when it comes how to prepare a bank reconciliation, and then consider using a program like QuickBooks or something like that, which provides us with those reports and transactions. I mean, essentially, when we start to use some kind of an electronic system, as opposed to even just like a check registry or something like that, a manual document, again, it just provides that more multiple levels of control. So let's talk a little bit about the budget. And so the budget is an important tool used by most boards to ensure that financial management responsibilities are being met. And we oftentimes just assume that, you know, everything's going to flow the way it should. But one of the best things about having a budget is it prepares us to, I think, plan for worst case scenarios. The first function is obviously that it helps us to understand what our goals and objectives are. And then the second function is we are able to, you know, look at previous years and understand where there might be gaps and variances. And so if we see a significant dip in hockey registrations, what does that mean? Does that mean that we're still going to be able to maintain the operations of the organization, or do we need to do some additional fundraising and that sort of thing? So the 5 elements of a budget needs to be thoughtfully prepared. It can be done in, you know, 1 or 2 sessions at a board meeting. It's broken down into time periods, which then match the time periods on financial statements. The financial statements are prepared annually or monthly, depending on, not annually, but monthly or quarterly. And we'll talk a little bit about financial statements. And the board should be prepared to take action if there is a great big difference between what was budgeted and what's actually happening. And so sometimes we do have to make difficult decisions mid-year just to protect our employees and again, the overall operations of the Minor Hockey Association. So let's talk a little bit about financial reporting. And so the first thing we want to keep in mind with our financial reports is that they are a snapshot of an organization's assets, liabilities, and net assets at a specific point in time. And so financial reporting timelines should be outlined in our board policies and then adhered to by the treasurer or the finance committee chair. Many boards will receive monthly treasurer's reports, while some boards will go to more quarterly. I think Minor Hockey Association's best practice would definitely be a monthly treasurer's report. And as board members, we need to familiarize ourselves with the organization's financial picture just to provide that good due diligence. So directors can be expected to review many different types of financial reports at different various points of time, but the dates in the calendar year will depend on your fiscal year end. Kelly, does everyone have the same fiscal year end? I should have asked that.
I would say that no, they probably don't.
Have different.
Now our fiscal year is May 1st to April 30th, kind of coincides with the hockey season, but I'm not aware of what everyone else's is.
Okay, Great. So sometimes, nonprofits will have a fiscal year end of December 30th. First, it makes sense with hockey associations, I think, to do it to coincide with the hockey year. But definitely you'd be wanting to do some kind of a budget review early in the fall, for example, draft of your audited financial statements in the spring, and an internal in-year financial report, like I said, either monthly or quarterly. And so the treasurer's report of any organization reports on the financial transactions to the board. This report is made monthly. If the organization meets every 2 months, then it can obviously be spread out. The purpose of financial reporting is to make sure that the board understands the financial position of the organization. And so if we do have to make those difficult decisions, the quicker that we're reported on and have to make that responsive actions that need to take place, the better. And so it is nice to have the treasurer's report monthly in advance of the board meeting so that everybody has a chance to take a look at it. The basics of a treasurer's report would be obviously the name of the hockey association, the period of the report and cover, the cash balance at the beginning of the period, the income it was received, the expenses paid during the period, the cash balance at the end of the period, and then best practice would be the signature of the treasurer. And so these would be some things that your auditors would be looking for. So this is just an example, cash balance at the beginning of the month, cash balance at the end, and then just any revenue that came through and any expenses. So one of the most important things to cover, I think, when it comes to our minor hockey associations is that all of our organization's bank accounts are reconciled each month, and then somebody else who isn't a check signer should have eyes on that bank account. This is a fairly new best practice, and it is just strictly as a response to fraud that has happened, I think, across Western Canada. They're an organization that I'm familiar with in Alberta. It's not a hockey association. It was another youth nonprofit association, but their executive director unfortunately had been misusing funds for about a year. And when they finally found out, they had left the country with about an additional $100,000 of the organization's funds. And so at the end of the day, when the auditor looked at it and they tried to figure out what the number one thing that organization, that those board members could have done to prevent that fraud, all it would have taken is one other person to have been monitoring the bank account and making sure that the reports, the numbers on the reports actually matched the bank account. Now, there must have been a fairly relaxed oversight on that board, because I know most nonprofits that I work with, the board chair is one of the persons that's doing the dual transaction authorizations on the account. And so they are in the bank account fairly often, making sure that those numbers are matching. But unfortunately, sometimes those important controls can be overlooked. And so that regular reconciliation is one of the most important things we can do as board members as far as oversight. So let's talk a little bit about reading financial statements. First of all of our reporting is based on a time frame, and so it's different for different reports. Keep in mind that there is a difference between the figures presented at one point in time, such as assets, liabilities, and net assets, and figures that are presented as cumulative sums over time. And so the total financial value of an activity during a fixed period of time, such as revenues and expenditures. Everybody still with me here? I've got some examples. So according to the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada, there are two key financial statements that we should review on a regular basis as part of the budgeting process, as part of monitoring our results, and then of course reviewing the auditor's financial statements. Those two reports are the statement of operations and the statement of financial position. And so the income statement is that one statement that actually is for a specific is for a period of time. So it's often, from June to December. It summarizes revenues and expenditures. It organizes them into various categories. It's very granular. I call it the micro one. As opposed to the balance sheet, which is a statement of financial position at a certain point in time. Ideally, it would be produced monthly. And it provides a statement of the Minor Hockey Association or the nonprofit and what would be left over if all of the assets were converted to cash and then used to pay off liabilities. And so in the case of, one of the nonprofits that I work with, for example, the Summer Games, when all is said and done on September 1st of 2024, we will dissolve the organization, convert all of our accounts to cash, and hopefully leave a legacy back into our community. Obviously, that's not the same with the Minor Hockey Association, where hopefully, this is going to be going on for years and years. But the balance sheet is more of that big picture, that macro. So some key facts to keep in mind. The budget categories and the revenue and expense categories should be the same from period to period so that they can be compared. An auditor may change some of them to conform to certain reporting requirements. And the headings on the statement include the name of the organization, the statement of operations, and the time period being reported. So here's an example of an income statement. And so you'll see here that the revenues are there, expenditures, excess of revenues over expenditures. And again, this is just a classic income statement. So you've got, let's say it's 2023 here, and you would have 2022 here, and then you can compare it as a board member. So one of the things that you're going to want to look at is any variances. In this case, everything looks pretty similar from one year to the next. Did you have a comment, Kelly?
I'm just wondering if you want me to share one of ours.
I would love that.
Okay, so if
I'm
you can
sure everybody would.
If you want to let me share the screen.
Absolutely.
Can you see that?
Yes, sir.
So this is a Hockey Saskatchewan income statement for the year ending January 31st. So revenue, expenses, we have specific categories that align with SAS Sport and our funding, and we have to do some significant reporting of our revenue and expenditures to SAS Sport because of the level of funding we receive from them. So you can see what the current month is, then the year to date, and then what our total budget is, so you can see the comparison. So this is reported to our finance audit committee and posted on a SharePoint on a monthly basis with an executive summary, with a balance sheet, and then revenue, and then a expense summaries, and then a details of expenses, because we probably have about 1,200 different accounts. I'm a little crazy that way, but this is an income statement that the board gets every month. They approve the statements monthly, ask any questions, and I provide a summary of that matches up maybe where we are in expenditures. There might be some changes, might be something slightly over or below what our projected budgets based on things that are going on through the year. So don't get too excited when you see a negative figure from a monthly basis, and don't get too excited when you see this amount here. That's just a year to date. You can see there's a lot of expenses that haven't been allocated yet to date and various things, but that gives you an idea of our budget, which is in that $4.5 million range.
Thank you, Kelly. Does anybody have any questions on that? Well, actually, the next slide here I've got provides you with some questions that board members can ask when it comes to an income statement. And no. And so we'll just roll right into the balance sheet, and then we'll see if you have any questions about that one in general. So the balance sheet then is, again, that macro, it's the statement of financial position, and it is at a particular point in time. And so essentially it's the total assets equal net assets plus total liabilities. And I'm going to just show you the slide because sometimes it's easier to explain when you can actually see the slide. And so a balance sheet is made up of these three parts. You've got your assets, your liabilities, and net assets. And then it's essentially, if you were to liquidate the organization, what you would have left over. And so liabilities are debts the organization has not paid, obviously. So any accounts payable, if you've got a mortgage on anything, And so those are the things that are still expected to be paying out. And equity in a non-for-profit organization is obviously, like in the case of the Summer Games, once we roll up, any assets that are left over just gets subtracted at the end, so that hopefully we have a positive number. And that's not a number in brackets with a deficit. Any questions about the balance sheet or the income statement? I know probably when you get the slides, it'll make a little more sense if you're new to the treasurer's role, for example, or anything around that financial oversight. Do you have any questions on that? So let's talk about these, the D in duties defined, as the slide says here. So I'm just going to get it up. So there are a number of different expectations that we carry as board members. And I often say that as board members, we have to have big shoulders because we can carry a lot of responsibility, and the weight of the community, the organization, all the hockey teams, the hockey players can be honest, it can feel quite daunting at times. And so we're going to start with the first duty of care, I guess you could say, when we are a board member, and that's the fiduciary duty. And so a fiduciary duty it's the law that is imposed on us to protect those that are vulnerable from those who have power over them. And so as board members, it doesn't matter whether you're a board member for a minor hockey association, big brothers, big sisters, whatever it might be, fiduciaries must put the interests of the other person above their own. And so directors are in a fiduciary relationship because of the position that we occupy within the organization. And so the assets that belong to the organization are even public assets. And so in some circumstances, they can only be managed through its directors. So understanding what those assets that we're managing is really important when we're on a board. So there's also the duty of loyalty. And so the duty of loyalty is also known as the fiduciary duty. And it requires that a director acts honestly and in good faith in the best interests of the organization. It's one of the primary duties of directors. And we can't delegate that duty. If we sign up to be a board member for a nonprofit, we can't delegate that. It's a personal duty, and we definitely have that duty to be loyal. So there's also the duty of care. And so this one is that duty where we exercise due diligence, where we exercise our skill, whatever our skill is that brings us to the table. It means that a director needs to be informed about an issue before making a decision relating to the issue. And so we shouldn't be flippantly, just raising our hand and saying yay or nay to motions that come forward to the board table. If we have to pause a discussion because we don't feel comfortable that we have all of the information, then that's that duty of care. It's that ability to know that sometimes we need to press pause. The law does not require directors to be experts in situations, but it does require us to act in accordance with a particular standard of care. It's generally accepted that the duty of care is heightened for directors in charitable organizations, and I would say it's heightened in any kind of athletic association as well. Generally speaking, it means that directors on a board need to take additional care and attention when we are discharging our duty of care, essentially making good decisions. We also have the duty to act honestly. And so directors must deal honestly with the organization and not act for an improper purpose. We need to be candid about informing our president if we can no longer afford the time commitment of being a director. So it's really about that self-knowledge piece. And so if we're suddenly bombarded with activities at work, or we have a change in our family situation, and we can no longer exercise the duties of care, fiduciary duties, then we do need to step up and say, this position isn't for me anymore, unfortunately. So then there's the duty of diligence. And so directors must be diligent in attending to their legal duties. And they would do that by obviously being informed, preparing for and attending meetings. Where there is advice of a specialized nature that's required, we need to engage qualified professionals. And so, for example, if we're writing a disciplinary letter for a staff member, we should make sure that we have a different set of eyes on that if that's not our skill set, whether that might be another board member, perhaps it's a legal firm, or even a human resources specialist. We need to make sure that we are diligently performing those duties, and also admitting, I guess, when we don't have the experience that's required for a certain scenario. We have to exercise our best judgment when voting on decisions and not just voting with the majority because we, peer pressure, or that's what we feel is the easiest way to get out of the meeting. It's 8 o'clock at night and we've got places to go, people to see, or maybe a hockey game to watch, whatever it might be. And sometimes we just want to get things moving. But unfortunately, sometimes the hasty decisions are the ones that can kick us in the place that hurts us the most. Directors must properly maintain minutes of meetings and ensure that all of our corporate records, whether those are held online or in traditional record books and that sort of thing, that they're always in proper order. And we could always put our fingers on the important things that we need to, like our bylaws, our policies, procedures, annual returns, financial statements. As board members, we should be able to either have those at our fingertips or request them of somebody else so that we can make sure that we are being good, diligent participants. We also have the duty to exercise power. And so directors are ultimately responsible for the organization. And so we oftentimes, especially in small communities, I find we don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to discipline an employee because they might be our neighbor. And I think that this is perhaps one of the most critical things that board members of nonprofits have the hardest understanding, that if we don't act on something that is going the wrong direction, if we just decide to avoid it or don't pay enough attention to it, it can often be the demise of an organization, or even worse, there could be health and safety ramifications or other laws that could even be broken. And so we have to make sure that we're developing standards for even doing things like staff performance reviews if we have staff that are working for us in our organization. And sometimes when we sign up to be a volunteer for a nonprofit, we don't realize that we may also be someone's boss then as a result. And again, that is an additional duty or responsibility that we are accountable for. So then there's also the duty of obedience. We're almost at the end of the D's. Directors must comply with all applicable laws and all of the organizing governing documents. So such as articles of bylaws, that sort of thing, constitution. And we need to ensure that corporate decisions are then being implemented. And so if we approve an expense to purchase new computer equipment for the staff, or if we make an expense for new equipment, we need to make sure that that's followed through with and followed through in the way that was approved by the board. And so I'm just going to stop there for a second and see if anybody has any questions with regards to those fiduciary duties, duty to act, that sort of thing. And I actually, before I go on to the next slide, there was a question in the chat when we took our break. And so that question was, are there any other associations that are under their local minor sports association where all sports are pooled together under minor sports? And then each sport tracks the funding coming in and out. And so that was just one of the questions in the chat.
I think that when I started 29 years ago, there was many more than what there is today. And I think that some of the issues that arise is when, people are focused just on their own sport and they see their money getting pooled into other sports and there's not a good reporting system, and they get caught up with the politics from one sport to another sport. And so I think it's always best to keep it separate. If you do want to be a minor sports, I think there's the odd one now still that is maybe baseball or minor ball and hockey, but you've got to have someone that's really doing a good job in their reporting for that, to keep records separate and reporting separately. But I think there's many of the ones that when I started have now separated into their own animal, if I want to use that term.
Yeah, and I know I was just chatting with a curling association the other day who was rolled into their rec board, as was, I think, the hockey association. And I think what the problem that it often comes down to is asset allocation. And so everybody's on a different page when it comes to where those assets would be prioritized. And so you would have to have a very strong community strategic plan so that everybody felt heard and respected in those situations, right? Does that kind of answer your question, Marette? I think that's how you say your name. Hopefully it does. You can just put any other comments in the chat if you want to there. Awesome.
Sorry, I know where Marette comes from, so I think that I've talked to some other board members there and gave them that same advice, that if you don't have good reporting and good controls over, it's probably best to be separate.
So with regards to those duties to act, duty to be diligent, and all of those things, that's sort of the nonprofit. It applies to every nonprofit. So I want to talk now a little bit about what it means in terms of the conduct as a minor hockey director. And so being a minor hockey association board member is very much an elevated leadership role. And it also then comes with elevated obligations and higher responsibilities. And that's not to say that the hockey association is more important than the local youth association or something like that. What I mean by that is that in your membership, in your arena, if you accept the role to be a minor hockey association board member, you accept some of that additional accountability. I think you become a leader because of that. And at the end of the day, we need to remember that we're ultimately responsible for the welfare of the organization as a whole. And so being a director means that the standard of care in all that we do is higher than that required in just, ordinary actions. And so even just the health and safety component, the anti-bullying, all of these things that are caught up with being part of the Minor Hockey Association board, we are leaders because of that. And so one of the things that we have to think about is that notion of conflict of interest. And so we did talk about conflict of interest in last week's session. We talked more about the policies and what kind of policies you should have around conflict of interest. But I want to talk a little bit about it specifically when it comes to, some of these scenarios. And so importantly, particularly for coaches, I think, acting as directors of organizations, and I'm sure that in a lot of small towns, that's the case. It's that notion of conflict of interest. And so there are really two rules that apply to directors who have other roles within organizations, such as coaching. And these rules are, the nonprofit rule and the non-conflict rule. And so the nonprofit rule states that the duty of loyalty requires that we avoid conflicts of interest. And directors should not benefit in any way from our relationship with the Minor Hockey Association. And I would say that sometimes a lot of the conflict that comes out of communities that are dealing with whether it's baseball associations, football associations, hockey associations, music festival associations, it's because of that perception that somebody is benefiting because they're on the board or that sort of thing. So what does it mean when it's broken down into hockey terms? Well, essentially the non-conflict rule states that directors cannot place themselves in a situation where their duty as a director conflicts with their own personal interests or with their duty to others, like the membership in general. And so what do these rules mean? Well, Coaches who are directors shouldn't put themselves in a position that would create a conflict between their duty to act in the best interests of the association, which would be their first duty, and their own personal interests. And so if you are put into that situation, if you have an interest, whether direct or indirect, with a contract, for example, that might be considered by the board, or even a decision that's being made by the board, you need to declare a conflict. And so then you need to ask yourself, will your actions as a director give benefit to some kind of a third party who you have a relationship with? And then again, it's a conflict. And so then it comes down to managing conflicts, because if you'll remember what we talked about last week, it's that nobody should be punished for being a volunteer in a nonprofit. Our kids shouldn't be punished because we stepped up to the plate, or we were voluntold to be on the minor hockey board because they didn't have enough people. The people that we have in our families, the people that we work for, the people we work with, shouldn't necessarily be punished because we're volunteers and we sit on a board. And so at the end of the day, all we need to do is identify the conflict and remove ourselves from the decision, which then assists in removing the issue at hand. And so there are so many ways of managing these conflicts. Oops, spelling mistake there. The policies of your organization will specifically state how to proceed if there's a conflict of interest. And so for most directors dealing with a situation of conflict, it's prudent and necessary to identify the conflict to your board chair. Oftentimes you'll see an agenda. The very first thing on the agenda is declaration of conflict of interest. And then just refrain from any discussion on the issue, and definitely remove yourself from voting on the issue. Bottom line, understand and be diligent about your conflict of interest policy. So it's all about that sort of wearing multiple hats in our communities. And it can be really hard when we play a dual role in our organization. And so if it's coaches, for example, who are directors, we will oftentimes be faced with potential conflicts. Managing them in a transparent way is the only way forward. And, you know, I liken it almost to spring's coming up and we're going to have a lot of potholes. We know that the pothole is in front of us, but maybe whether or not we admit it and drive around it or actually mitigate through it is absolutely critically important, as opposed to just pretending that it's not there. And it's a crucial part of being a director, and especially in small communities where we wear multiple hats. And so I'm going to stop talking here for a second, and I want to have a bit of a discussion around conflict of interest, but it's oftentimes the difference between what is intended and what is perceived. I guarantee that if you ask most people who have been accused of having a conflict of interest, they will tell you that they are able to manage the weight of wearing multiple hats, and that they're a good sense of judgment, or they have a good sense of judgment, and that they can manage it, that they don't have that bias necessarily. But the question is what a reasonable third party looking at the situation might perceive. And so an accusation of conflict of interest isn't necessarily a condemnation of a person. It's just a rightful concern with the situation or a perception. Coming out in front of it is what is so fundamentally important. So I'm just going to stop sharing there and just find out if you've been confronted with situations of conflict of interest, and if you have any questions or even suggestions about how you've sort of, overcome some of that in some of your minor hockey association boards. I know, Kelly, when we talked, you had some really good examples of conflict of interest and how your policies even can help you to mitigate and get through those policies.
Can you repeat your question? I missed part of it there.
For sure, Sarah. And so the question is, how many of you have had instances of conflict of interest? And do you have any insight to even share with the rest of the group on how you've kind of navigated through them? I know that's kind of putting people on the spot as well.
Yeah,
But I
not
think
everybody all at once, hey? Like I can jump in just and very briefly. So from
Sure.
our MHA, yeah, clearly, right, with our volunteers who would be coordinators or board members, et cetera, who have children playing, some of them would be considered elite, right? If there's ever even a remote perceived conflict of interest, they're just, it's an automatic. That parent steps back, they step out, they're not involved when it comes to evaluations or placement, scrimmage groups, any of those kinds of things. There's no question, right? They're just, now you're going to help with a different age division altogether. You're not involved with your child's division.
That's terrific. That sounds like you've got a good culture around it and are practicing some really good processes.
Yeah, and those board members, then those parents / board members aren't involved in handling scores or anything that comes from the evaluators. Those are passed on to other board members or coordinators or whatever the case is. Those parents / volunteers, board members, directors just aren't involved in.
I think what's really good, and I like what Sarah said, I think to go further on that, it's really important to put all those practices in a written form and from a policy perspective, and to make sure that all of your parents know that, maybe a couple of times a year, advising them of what that is, because it's very easy to for people just to say, well, the politics of hockey, and that's why my kid this, or I got screwed this. And I think it's really important to make people aware of that.
That's true. Very true.
From the communication aspect, because I just know the types of things that, we get made aware of here in the office. And I know that it's a lot, but it doesn't compare to what's actually going on out there. So I think it's really important, because the perception of a conflict of interest is worse than sometimes the actual conflict. And
that's fair. Yeah, you're right. Absolutely.
Yeah, and so that transparency of sharing those policies, so that people who aren't aware of the policies don't assume that hasn't been thought out and that it hasn't been mitigated, just like Sarah said, right? So,
well, the worst thing for me, some of the best thing about hockey is the lobby, and it's one of the worst things about hockey is the lobby. So.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the lobby with regards to communication in a few minutes here, because I have lots of memories of the hockey lobby in my small town too. So, okay. So another really important policy to have is a code of conduct, and a lot of you will have seen great codes of conduct, even just for behavior of fans and people who are watching hockey and that sort of thing. It's just, even for yourself as board members, to have a code of conduct that you would sign as a board member along with any staff that you have. And there's just no better tool than a code of conduct to ensure that everybody shares those same values and that they're being adhered to. And it's also a great resource for chairs if there is conflict or inappropriate behavior in meetings, to be able to bring people back to a code of conduct. This is a really blurry, I need to retype this, example of a volunteer code of conduct. This is a Canadian Cancer Society one. And it just talks about the things that as volunteers, we're going to make sure that we don't personally gain from the organization. We're going to identify the conflict of interest. We're going to maintain confidentiality. We're going to guard our privileged information. If we have, respectful conduct issues, that our volunteers will make sure that they're also following that. And I've got to just, now that I zoomed in, I got to get that back. There we go. If you are concerned about board oversight when it comes to policies, you can even ask your board members to sign off on a checklist such as this one, just to make sure that they've read the board policies. And so making sure that they understand that board code of conduct, and that the duties and expectations of the director, that they understand the conflict of interest policy, and just have your board members actually just sign something like this to declare that they get it, right? So now we're going to roll into board meetings, never board meetings. Sorry, that's an old Rotary joke, but we want to make sure that your board meetings for your minor hockey association go smoothly and that they're effective and efficient. And so one of the things that, you know, we always want to ask is sort of this essential dozen. So if you can imagine a great board meeting, you'd have the agenda in advance, the right people would be in the room, committee members would be prepared to contribute. You'd know why you were invited. Nobody would dominate the discussion. Everybody's opinions and viewpoints would be heard and respected. Decisions would be made and action taken. And even to the, you know, extent that we would evaluate our meetings and improve upon them regularly. So this is kind of an ideal situation for a board to have great meetings like this. And these are some other just tips and tools when it comes to the board meetings. I'm curious to know how many of you are actually presidents of your minor hockey association, or you're maybe responsible for chairing the meetings. I know we've got a couple of board chairs on the call here, but you can even put it in the chat there if you are the chair of your meetings. Holly is awesome. Sarah's assistant commissioner, perfect. So that's good. Hopefully you'll be able to use some of these tips and strategies when it comes to chairing meetings. And so, you know, at the end of the day, it is the board chair that runs the meetings. All remarks should be addressed through the chair. We try not to interrupt each other. We aim for consensus. When we can't get consensus, then we have to, you know, resort to a vote. The majority wins the vote and all members accept the majority decision. So here's just a kind of list of the types of people that we might get at board meetings. So first of all, we might have the extrovert, the dominant speaker. We might have the silent attendee, the competitive person. We've always got somebody like that at our board meetings. They have to, my husband calls it one up. And so even in our marriage, he'll be like, one up, Wendy, you got it. But there's always somebody like that at the board table. The socializer, you know, the person that always wants to deal with conflict. The disinterested person, the one that's on their smartphone all night. And then the one that's guarding against groupthink. I've got a board member like that right now, and it doesn't matter what we're voting on. They always vote against the group just because they don't want to be the one that said, you know, kind of went along with the flow. So during discussion, the overall responsibility when discussion is underway, it's the chairperson's responsibility to ensure that it continues to flow smoothly by making sure that not, you know, one or two people aren't dominating the meeting. And then, of course, I'm sure most of your minor hockey associations will follow some kind of rule of order, whether that's Robert's Rule of Order or something like that. And so we do have to make motions at our meetings sometimes. And a motion is a request or a proposal for an action to be taken by a board. It's usually made by the director. And motions can be used to accept reports, accept decisions of the majority, even adjourn meetings. Motions are simply made by a director stating, I move that we, you know, whatever the motion might be. I've got some examples coming up here. One of the things, if you are the chair or the president, make sure that everybody understands who gets to vote. So you might have some non-voting members at your board meetings. It's always good to just make sure that everybody's comfortable so that there's no awkwardness if all of a sudden you have people voting that actually don't have a vote on the board. Another really great governance practice is to create a motion index. And so this would be in addition to your minutes. It's a document that would provide a list of all of your decisions related to motions. It's numbered, and then it can be easily referenced by volunteers and staff. And it's usually a secondary document, and that secondary document can just save so much time and frustration when you're referencing important issues. So that's just a bit of a best practice that you might want to consider. So here are some different kinds of motions. So there's a main motion, which would be to introduce a new item. There's a subsidiary motion, which would be how to handle that main motion, a privileged motion, an incidental motion, a motion to table, which kills a motion, or a motion to postpone, and that might be to delay a vote or that sort of thing. So every motion has 6 steps. And so to start out with, you know, a member raises their hand to signal the chairperson. They need a seconder. And so if you don't have a seconder on a motion, then the motion dies. There's, it simply doesn't go anywhere. Once the motion is made, the chairperson would restate the motion, and then there's discussion. And no other discussion can go on around the board table about any other issues until that motion has been resolved. Finally, after everybody has had a chance to talk, then you would vote on the motion. The chairperson would restate the motion, ask for the people who are supporting it, ask for the people who are against it, and then announce the vote so that whoever's recording the minutes can make sure that they record it properly. And so I'm just going to stop sharing there for a second. I had my hand up. Well, that's interesting. Trying to get my own attention. Here, I thought somebody else had a question. So here's a sample script. And again, we'll send these slides off to Kelly so that you don't have to remember all of this right now. And I don't have to repeat it right now either, because we are getting close to the end of the session. But basically, you're going to run through all of the different nuances that we just talked about. And then, at the final, after everybody has voted, the chair will simply say, motion is carried or motion is defeated. So any questions about motions, making decisions? I know I was faced with a chairing a meeting this week where we had, we referenced Hockey Saskatchewan's strategic plan. And so we were talking about community and social impact. And I specifically referenced the strategic plan of Hockey Saskatchewan. And we had a really great discussion about representation of minorities on the board and what that might mean. And it was just a really good discussion. But I didn't feel comfortable as board chair that everybody had had an opportunity to talk or to speak to the issue. And so we actually stopped the discussion at one point and we did a complete roundtable so that everybody had an opportunity to speak. And I think sometimes we get caught up in the rush or in the heat of the moment, and we forget to just take a second and say, okay, has everybody had an opportunity to express their opinion on this important decision? Does anybody have any questions about chairing meetings or how to make motions or anything like that?
I just think one thing, Wendy, since COVID, we do so much of these virtual meetings, which has changed the way the meeting gets operated a little bit. So I know it's, you and I are the only ones that have our cameras on. And so a lot of times that makes it difficult if you have a big board, because it might slow down, etc. But if you have a smaller board, I encourage people to try and have their cameras on, because then you're kind of seeing if you're paying attention in the meeting or not. But I think the other thing is when if you're sharing a screen and you're calling for a motion, to be able to see people and people to jump in and to say things. But then also when it comes to voting, I think we've gone who is opposed, not saying who's in favor right away. So speak up if you're opposed in a virtual meeting. And if there isn't anybody, then you just, you make that assumption then that everyone is in favor and you move on. So, but as long as everyone knows that beforehand, I think I've seen that change.
I think that's a really good point, Kelly. And we talked a little bit about hybrid meetings, and sometimes it's really hard because a lot of boards coming out of the pandemic are trying to do hybrid meetings. So where you've got some people in person and some people dialing in, and that as a board chair can be quite tricky to manage the expectations of the people that are in person and the people that are online, and making sure that you've got somebody that's monitoring the online version. And I almost think that if we are chairing hybrid meetings, we almost need a tech person, somebody who's actually in charge of watching the chat and making sure that they're relaying to the board chair any of the comments that are coming through and that sort of thing, because it's hard to navigate between the two spaces. Another really great tool if you are doing hybrid meetings is to utilize that breakout room component for just some fellowship. And I know sometimes, like if you're on a provincial board, for example, and you don't meet in person very often, it can be just looking at a screen. It might not feel very personal. It's hard to build goodwill and fellowship. And so using that breakout room function and even giving people some icebreaker questions that they can kind of get to know each other a little bit for 5 minutes and then bring everybody back into the main room again can be a really helpful tip for building that camaraderie, I guess you could say, amongst the board. Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about membership engagement and just communication, leadership, and values. And so being, we've talked about all of the nitty gritty things tonight. We talked about, financial oversight and avoiding fraud, and we've talked about, the weight of being a board member and what it means to have that fiduciary duty. But now let's talk a little bit about that membership engagement, communication, leadership, and values, and how important that is on our overall experience, just to be responsible, I guess you could say, to that, the people that we serve. And so the importance of communication with member engagement, one of the things with membership is just to be, absolutely crystal clear and transparent and keeping people informed and aware. Often it's when we don't communicate out our important decisions and changes in policy that people will make a mountain out of a molehill, so to speak. And so it is important to know what our policies and regulations are when it comes to, just things like coach, team, and official selection, team formation, affiliation usage, fundraising, all the key policies. And just as we mentioned with the conflict of interest policy, do the parents understand what the association and what board members are doing to mitigate some of those conflicts of interest? And so that communication piece is just so important. And, after you've made a decision for the membership or the ownership of your local minor hockey association, you first and foremost must remember that you represent the membership or the owners of the organization. And so following your policies on those decisions to ensure consistency in future decisions is really important. And we talked about this last week, but I just wanted to make sure that we just brought the message home again tonight, that this is why we have bylaws, policies, and procedures in the first place, so that we're not always reinventing the wheel. And this definitely prevents fluctuation and wavering in decision-making models. So what are your best practices when it comes to communicating to your parents and constituents and stakeholders? I'm really curious to know how you all get your message out. So before I go through some of my ideas there, I'm just curious, do you use social media? Do you use newsletters? How are you communicating right now? I know one of the things that I've seen some arenas have are the electronic billboards inside the lobby. So when Kelly mentioned, sometimes the discussion that goes on in the lobby, wouldn't it be a great thing if we simply had, a monitor that had some of our policies and decisions and announcements just always running in our lobbies through a PowerPoint? That would be a great way to get our messages across. So that would be one sort of innovative way that we could do it. Obviously, good social media practices is something else that we can do. Newsletters is a great way to communicate with people if we've got email addresses and that sort of thing. And then I've even seen some really creative use of open houses. And so just wondering, so there's some good comments in the chat here. Bulletin boards in the rank, Facebook, email. Open houses are another really great way that you can do it, especially if you've got decisions that you want the membership to be involved with. And I saw an organization that they basically had an open house with 3 or 4 questions that they wanted to gauge the membership on. And so they created 4 little areas where they had 2 buckets and another bucket with pucks. And they asked the question to the parents and the players, and then they voted with the pucks. And so if they were in favor of it, they put it into the yes bucket. And if they weren't, they put it into the no bucket. It was such a creative way to get parents and kids involved. Everybody wanted to vote with their puck. And they ended up getting such great consensus from their group that there was nobody that didn't vote at the end of the week based on, and they had crystal clear answers then to the questions. And I think in this particular sense, it was about whether or not to renovate their rink or build a new rink, or, they were pretty hefty questions that they were asking. So sometimes we have to think outside the box a little bit and come up with some innovative ways to get that feedback from our membership.
One thing, Wendy, that we did within our SAS First program, we always heard about the politics on the selection process of kids. And so, we felt as staff that people wouldn't read, maybe a 3 or 4 or 5 page document on it. So we just created a video. And so once someone applies for SAS First, when they're sent back, they get it, before the camp, they get a video that explains what the evaluation process is and what we use in it and how we rank players, and the evaluators provide scores and how it goes in. So now, if someone starts talking about in the lobby that, well, there's politics and, the team is picked beforehand and all those type of things, people can come back and say, well, no, that's not how it is, because they explained to us. And so it was, it doesn't have to be a long video, but sometimes people will listen to a video as opposed to spend time reading, or they might gloss over some of the important parts in the document and focus on one element of it, and it distorts what the reality is. So, we found that works pretty effectively.
Yeah, and I know, we don't have to go to big expenses sometimes to over communicate. And, one of the great things we can do as a board is do a bit of an environmental scan, maybe once a year, through like a SWOT. And so we talked about SWOTs last week, but, just simply where we list out the strengths of our organization, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats, and then just create messaging around those items. So if you took your top 3 strengths, your top 3 opportunities, your top 3 challenges, and your top 3 weaknesses, and created a 2 or 3 point PowerPoint slide on each of those things and had that running in your hockey lobbies, so that it was just constantly being reminded about for people what your key messaging was on some of those really important issues. It would be that over communicating that I think people sometimes need. So the other thing that sometimes we have to manage on our boards is just that difference between conflict and contrast. And so in good functioning and achieving boards, everybody gets along. I'm not thinking that always happens on our minor hockey association boards. And so in great functioning and high achieving boards, very few people are like-minded, but everybody respects the process and values. If you're the board chair or the hockey president, then you need to have some good facilitation skills. If you see conflict at the table, just make sure everybody's being respectful. And again, that's just another great way to go back to your code of conduct, which I've already shown you that sample. And at the end of the day, we're all passionate about hockey. And so hockey is a game that brings out passion. Just ask my husband and son when the Oilers score. I mean, I was never a hockey player, but I love the game. And so the key is to understand how these emotions can be used in a positive and respectful manner. There's always going to be conflict. For all that the good sport brings, it can also bring stress. And so that might be the pressure to perform. It could be challenges in learning, even differences in personalities that can create conflict. But conflict isn't always bad. Again, it's the contrasting opinions or conflicting opinions. And that's when we just always need to be checking our values. So having, as a minor hockey association, understanding what your values are, and whether it's both organizational and personal, and then just making sure that those good policies are in place, just as was mentioned in last week's presentation. So there's only a couple slides left, but when we do face a hurdle, the puck stops here. And so it's about being respectful, actively listening, and not taking things personally. So if you're the board member that always gets the criticism and people complaining about things, just remember it's not personal. Try to diffuse the situation, because oftentimes somebody just wants to be heard. And there is nothing that causes conflicts to spiral, from that, into a huge situation is because of a lack of respect. Again, just a reminder, here's the values that Hockey Sask has come up with. And so, fun, safety, community, inclusivity, respect, and passion. And so if we're always checking ourselves against even these just amazing values, that makes making some of those difficult decisions that much easier. And so then just to, remind all of you just that you are leaders, and leadership is, it's not reserved for a few people. It is the process of ordinary people, bringing forth the best from themselves and from others. It's a dialogue, not a monologue. It isn't about personality. It's about constantly moving forward and about practicing. And it's about an identifiable set of skills and practices that we all can learn. And so, that's a bit of a challenge for you when it comes to being on some of these boards, is just always not just bringing out the best in yourself, but bringing out the best in your stakeholders and the people who are sitting around the table with you as well. And so it's 7:29 and we accomplished our mission. And so we've talked about, the due diligence of a financial board member. And so what that means, making sure that we're thinking about preventing fraud and that we're always dotting our I's and crossing our T's, recruiting treasurers to a position that fully understand the scope of what they need to do, and also using those innovative best practices now that are available to us as volunteers so that we aren't, creating more work than is necessary through some of those really great programs that are out there. Understanding that overall risk awareness and aversion, some of the duties of a board chair and how to chair a meeting and look at how to do Robert's Rules of Order and that sort of thing. Engaging our membership and then communicating some of those decisions to membership. And we also talked a lot about that conflict of interest piece, and it sounds like you're all on the right path when it comes to mitigating some of those conflicts of interest. So any questions that anybody has? I would love to, once again, just sharing the strategic plan for Hockey Saskatchewan there, which you'll also all be familiar with. But does anybody have any questions or anything that they want to share in the last couple of minutes? It's a lot of information. I think we went through 87 or 90 slides. And so I probably did sound a little bit like an auctioneer at times.
If there's no questions or anything, I really want to thank you, Wendy. Appreciate everything you've done. And thanks everybody for attending. Just a reminder that, we'll send the recording and the PowerPoint out to everybody. We'll also make it available on our YouTube channel and will be on our website. But if you have anything follow up, feel free to call the office. We're here to help you as well. So thanks again, Wendy, and thanks everybody for attending tonight.
Thanks,
Take
Kelly.
care. Thanks, Wendy.